He promised me forever beneath the old oak tree. His uniform was rough, his future uncertain, but his vow was the purest thing I had ever known. We planned a life built on love, far from the suffocating demands of society. But fate, as it often does, had a cruel twist waiting. Before his ship even reached foreign shores, his family's debt became a shadow and an alliance had to be forged. I watched as the man who swore his soul to me returned, only to give his hand, his name, and his future to my sister. This is a story of duty versus desire, of a forbidden love that burns beneath a veil of respectability and the shattering cost of honor. This is the truth behind the wedding everyone admired. Settle in and prepare to have your heart broken. You won't want to miss a moment of this intricate web of betrayal and yearning. And if you are captivated by Eleanor and William's tragic journey, please like this video and subscribe so you don't miss devastating installment. Part 1. The Promise. The scent of dry earth and late summer lavender clung to the air, a final, heavy sweetness before the coming frost. Eleanor stood beneath the sprawling boughs of the oak tree at the edge of the Langley estate, her hands clasped tightly, not from cold, but from a desperate need to anchor herself. Before her stood William, his tall, strong frame encased in the new regimentals, a rough, deep blue wool that felt foreign and too rigid against his familiar warmth. He was leaving for the war, an ill-fated conflict in some distant, muddy foreign land that felt impossibly far from the gentle, rolling hills of their home in Kent. "You must not worry, Elle. I'll be back," William said, his voice a low, steady rumble that always quieted the anxious flutter in her chest. Except this time, it couldn't. His attempt at a reassuring smile didn't quite reach his eyes, which were stormy with a mixture of excitement for the duty ahead and a profound, agonizing reluctance to leave her. Eleanor slowly lifted her gaze to meet his. She did not cry. Crying was her sister Catherine's domain, an elegant, dramatic display. Eleanor's grief was a quiet, internal pressure, a cold, hard stone settling in the pit of her stomach. "Of course you will," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor running through her hands. "But a promise is only as strong as the intent behind it, William. Tell me again." He moved closer, his gauntleted hand reaching up to gently cup her cheek. The leather was cool and smooth against her skin, a soldier's touch that was already replacing the softer hand she knew. "I will return, Eleanor," he vowed, the words barely audible, meant only for her. "I will come back to you. The moment I set foot on English soil, I will come straight here. I will ride harder than any man has ever ridden to get to you." He paused, his thumb brushing a stray lock of dark hair from her face, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that promised more than just survival. "I have no fortune to speak of, not yet," William continued, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "My father's debts are still a shadow over the Ashworth name. But I will earn a name for myself. I will do my duty, and then I will come home and make you my wife. You and I, Elle, we are meant to be. We have been since we were children, climbing this very tree." Eleanor closed her eyes, letting the truth of his words sink into her bones, trying to store up the sound of his voice and the feel of his touch to last her through the desolate months ahead. She was the quieter sister, the one who preferred books and solitude to the whirl of social life. William was the only person who had ever truly seen her, cherishing the strength she kept hidden beneath her gentle demeanor. "I don't care about a fortune, William. I only care about you," she whispered, leaning into his touch. "Just come back whole. That is all I ask." He lowered his head, and their kiss was a silent, desperate seal on the promise. It wasn't the light, innocent peck of a childhood crush. It was a deep, fervent exchange, charged with the sudden, sharp awareness of all the danger and distance that was about to separate them. It was a solemn, sacred vow spoken not in front of an altar, but beneath an old oak, binding their two souls with a covenant more powerful than any legal document. When they finally parted, his chest was rising and falling rapidly. He reached into the inner pocket of his new coat and pulled out a small, worn silver locket, a plain, unadorned oval on a thin chain. "Wear this," he instructed, clasping the chain around her neck. "Keep it close to your heart. When I return, I'll exchange it for the real thing." He touched the locket gently. "It belonged to my mother. She would have loved you." Eleanor felt a fresh wave of devotion wash over her. This was more than a betrothal. It was an acceptance into his family, into his very lineage. He spent another hour with her, sitting side by side, speaking of the future they would build. A small, cozy home. Children who would climb the same oak, a life free from the suffocating demands of society and money. They spoke with the reckless abandon of youth, convinced that their love was a shield strong enough to deflect cannons and fate itself. The sun began to dip, casting long, melancholy shadows across the grass. The sound of a carriage approaching the main house forced them back to reality. William's final moments had arrived. He stood, pulling her up with him. I must go now. No more agonizing farewells. This is au revoir, not goodbye. Eleanor nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She understood. Protracted goodbyes were just torture. She stepped back, giving him the space to leave. She would remain strong for him, a bastion of hope waiting behind. As William turned to walk away, he stopped and looked back one last time. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw the promise reflected. Forever. He gave her a sharp, resolute nod, spun on his heel and walked quickly through the twilight toward the main house, where his father, Lord Ashworth, waited to take him to the port. Eleanor watched until the very last flash of his blue uniform disappeared around the bend. She touched the cold silver locket beneath her gown, feeling its weight, its promise. She did not stir for a long time, rooted to the spot beneath the oak, committed to the long, difficult vigil ahead. Her life was paused, waiting for the echo of a returning carriage and the footfalls of the man who had promised her forever. Part 2. The shattering news. 2 years crawled by, measured not in seasons, but in the thin, infrequent letters that arrived from William. They were always brief, censored dispatches, filled with vague descriptions of cold weather and hard marching, but always, always sealed with a phrase that was their private code. The oak still stands. Eleanor cherished them, tracing the firm, familiar slant of his handwriting late into the night. Her life at Langley had become a quiet monument to patience. While her mother and sister, Catherine, buzzed with the seasonal social circuit, Eleanor held herself apart. Catherine, with her stunning blonde hair and effortless charm, was the clear focus of attention. Suitors fluttered around her like moths to a lamp, but Eleanor barely noticed. She wore the silver locket beneath every gown, a cool, constant pressure against her breastbone, her promise. Then the long silence broke. The war ended, not with a triumphant roar, but with a weary sigh. The official news spread slowly through the country houses. Eleanor's heart began to beat with a painful, frantic hope. Any day now, William would return, and their future would finally begin. The letter announcing his arrival, however, did not come from William. It was an invitation arriving on heavy, crested paper from the Ashworth estate, merely a mile down the road. It was addressed to the entire Langley family, requesting their attendance at a dinner celebration to welcome Lord William Ashworth home, and more importantly, to announce a joyful occasion. Eleanor's hands shook as she unfolded the parchment. Her mother, seated at the breakfast table, peered at the crest through her spectacles. "Ah, the Ashworths! Splendid news!" her mother murmured. "William is back. We must make sure Catherine is dressed appropriately tonight. They have always been close neighbors." Eleanor felt a rush of heat to her face. Tonight. He was back tonight. He hadn't come straight to the oak, but a dinner invitation was understandable. He had to face his family, his father, Lord Ashworth, who was a severe, demanding man. Still, a faint thread of unease coiled in her stomach. She spent the day in a state of suspended animation, fluttering between elation and anxiety. She chose a simple gown, a soft forest green that made her eyes appear deeper, and finally slipped the silver locket over the silk of her dress, a silent, defiant announcement of her claim. When the Langley family carriage pulled up to the grand, imposing entrance of Ashworth Hall that evening, Eleanor was the first to step out. The hall, always slightly faded and austere, seemed somehow brighter, buzzing with a nervous energy. She spotted him immediately. He stood by the fireplace, talking to his father, his uniform replaced by impeccably tailored civilian evening clothes. He was older, harder, and impossibly more handsome. The boy she had kissed goodbye was now a man, etched with the experience of war. A small white scar angled just above his left brow, a testament to the years they had spent apart. His eyes swept across the gathering crowd, a practiced, distant gaze, until they landed on her. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. All the noise, all the people, all the anxiety in the room vanished. For a single agonizing moment, it was just the two of them beneath the oak tree again. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, his body freezing mid-gesture. A shockwave of pure recognition and intense emotion passed between them, so potent Eleanor nearly swayed. He saw the locket. He saw her. He began to walk toward her, a determined, swift stride, his lips parted as if to speak her name. And then Catherine moved. Her sister, beautiful in a gown of shimmering peach silk, glided effortlessly in front of Eleanor. "William, my dearest William, you are home," Catherine cried, a perfect, heartfelt sound. She didn't just greet him. She took his arm, wrapping her hand securely around his bicep and leaning into his side with an air of possessive familiarity that made Eleanor's blood run cold. William stopped dead, a mere 3 feet from Eleanor. His eyes were still fixed on her, but the determination in his stride had been instantly replaced by a deep, palpable anguish. It was a look of a man who had been dealt a sudden, crippling blow. "Catherine," he managed, his voice thick, his gaze not leaving Eleanor. Catherine, oblivious, beamed up at him. "Come, William, do not stand here in the doorway. Your father is quite beside himself with pride, and besides—" She lowered her voice conspiratorially, though loudly enough for all nearby to hear. "I want to hear all about your adventures before the announcement." The word announcement hit Eleanor like a physical blow, drawing her attention to the small, heavily polished table near the entrance. Resting on a velvet cushion was a small, glittering object, a sapphire and diamond ring, unmistakably an engagement ring. Eleanor stared at the ring, then back at William, who was now being tugged away by Catherine. His eyes, when they met hers again, were filled with a raw, desperate apology, a silent scream of explanation. She understood everything instantly, with a terrible, icy clarity. She didn't need the formal announcement. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with devastating precision. Lord Ashworth's crippling debts, William's ambition to earn a name and fortune, Catherine's undisputed beauty, and her father's substantial dowry. William hadn't merely returned. He had returned to execute a contract, a transaction designed to save his ancestral home. He had promised her forever, but he was taking a bride who came with the collateral required to redeem the Ashworth name. Lord Ashworth clapped William heartily on the back, gathering the guests into the drawing room. The moment of truth arrived, brutal and swift. "Friends, neighbors," Lord Ashworth's booming voice cut through the nervous chatter. "We celebrate not only the safe return of my son, William, but the securing of our family's future. It is my great joy to announce the betrothal of my son, Lord William Ashworth, and the beautiful Miss Catherine Langley." A polite chorus of applause erupted, but Eleanor heard none of it. Her mind registered only the words, "betrothal, Miss Catherine Langley." Catherine turned to William, a triumphant, joyous smile illuminating her face. She reached up and kissed him soundly on the cheek, then offered him her hand so he could slip the magnificent sapphire ring onto her finger. The light caught the diamonds, sending shards of brutal, glittering pain into Eleanor's heart. She saw William's face as he performed the action. He looked less like a joyous groom-to-be and more like a man walking a gangplank. His movements were mechanical, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. The crowd pressed in, offering congratulations. Eleanor stood paralyzed in the periphery, her hand instinctively clutching the worn plain silver locket on her own chest. The contrast was a cruel joke, a simple, honest promise pitted against the magnificent, glittering reality of the shattering news. William finally pulled free from the well-wishers. He had to speak to her. He had to offer some explanation, some word to soften the impossible cruelty of the scene. He took a step towards her, his face a mask of pleading remorse, when a high, demanding laugh from Catherine drew his attention back. "William, darling, come and tell my mother exactly what you think of the ring." William hesitated for a torturous second, his eyes locked on Eleanor's. In that moment, Eleanor saw the man of honor she loved, the man who felt the crushing weight of his duty, choose his obligation. He gave her a final, pleading look that said, "I am sorry, I am trapped," before turning his back on her and walking over to his fiancée. Eleanor felt the gentle strength she prided herself on finally give way. She had to leave, or she would shatter. Without a word to anyone, she turned and fled the drawing room, heading blindly for the cool night air outside. The sound of happy chatter and celebratory toasts faded behind her. She didn't stop until she reached the carriage drive. She stared up at the vast, uncaring sky, the silver locket heavy and cold against her racing heart. He had returned, but he was lost to her. The promise whispered beneath the oak was now nothing more than a painful ghost in the face of her sister's glittering, undeniable reality. Part 3. The day of the wedding dawned bright and mercilessly clear, a perfect, sun-drenched mockery of Eleanor's inner turmoil. Ashworth Hall had been transformed. What was once austere now glittered with rented finery, garlands of white roses, and the loud, cheerful bustle of a society wedding meant to distract from the Ashworths' precarious financial state. This was not a wedding built on love, but a calculated, expensive merger. Eleanor felt like a ghost moving through her own life. She was forced into the role of bridesmaid, standing near Catherine in a dress of pale blue silk that felt heavy and suffocating. Catherine, radiant and utterly oblivious to the quiet tragedy unfolding beside her, was a vision of bridal beauty. She wore her happiness like a crown, her hand occasionally rising to touch the magnificent sapphire ring that proclaimed her victory. The moment the organ music swelled and announced the entrance of the groom, Eleanor's breath hitched. William stood at the altar, waiting. He was even more devastatingly handsome in his wedding attire. The dark coat and crisp white cravat highlighted the solemn gravity of his expression. He looked every inch the Lord, dignified, reserved, and utterly miserable. Their eyes met across the nave, a sharp, momentary collision that was more painful than any physical injury. For William, that glance was a silent scream of betrayal. For Eleanor, a confirmation that the man she loved was still inside the shell of the man about to commit a terrible sacrifice. He looked away instantly, snapping his gaze back to the empty aisle, as if afraid to look at her again lest his resolve crumble. The ceremony was a blur of ritualistic cruelty. Eleanor stood close enough to hear every vow, every binding promise. When the priest intoned the words, "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer," Eleanor's vision tunneled. She felt the weight of her own forgotten promise, the silver locket hidden beneath her bridesmaid dress, cool and heavy against her heart. She watched William take Catherine's hand. As he repeated his vows, his voice was flat, devoid of the emotion she had heard beneath the oak tree. He spoke the words to Catherine, but his posture, the slight tremor in his hand, the rigid set of his shoulders, all of it screamed a contradiction to the only person in the room who understood the depth of his compromise. The critical moment came when William was instructed to place the wedding ring on Catherine's finger. Eleanor was standing directly beside her sister. As William reached for the ring, his hand brushed against Catherine's, but his eyes, drawn by some irresistible, agonizing pull, lifted and found Eleanor's face. It was a look that lasted barely a second, yet contained an eternity of anguish and unspoken truth. It wasn't a look of lust or flirtation. It was the desperate, drowning plea of a man forced to sign away his soul. In that fleeting instant, Eleanor gave him a silent answer, a minuscule shake of her head that was imperceptible to anyone else. "I see your pain. I understand your sacrifice." It was a moment of profound, painful intimacy, a secret exchange made just as he committed himself legally and publicly to her sister. He looked away, his jaw tightening, and slipped the gold band onto Catherine's finger. The pronouncement followed, "I now pronounce you man and wife." The kiss was brief, a formality. Catherine flushed with joy, radiant as William dutifully turned to greet his new family and friends. Throughout the wedding breakfast, the painful charade continued. Eleanor was seated far down the table, yet she could not escape the sight of them. William performed his duties as a new husband with meticulous politeness. He smiled when expected, offered toasts with admirable composure, and held Catherine's arm as they navigated the room. But every time he thought himself unobserved, his gaze would flick over the heads of the guests, searching for Eleanor. She caught him watching her several times, while Catherine was preoccupied with the congratulations, while his father delivered a long, rambling speech. Each time his expression was identical, a fleeting mixture of profound regret and an almost aggressive, possessive sorrow. Late in the afternoon, during a lull in the festivities, Catherine and William were posing for a formal portrait in the hall's gallery. Eleanor found herself alone near the library, the noise of the party suddenly distant. She needed air, space, a moment to reassemble the shattered pieces of her composure. As she stood staring out a window overlooking the now empty drive, a shadow fell over her. Eleanor. The sound of his voice, speaking her name after all this time and against the background of his wedding, was an electric shock. She spun around. William stood behind her, his breath ragged, his dark eyes ablaze with the torment she had glimpsed at the altar. "You cannot be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Someone will see." "I don't care," he said, taking a step toward her. His hand reached out, halting a few inches from her arm. The desire to touch her warred with the duty that now stood between them. "I had to speak to you. Just a word. I need you to know." "I know," Eleanor cut him off, her voice barely steady. "The estate. The debt. Lord Ashworth required a substantial dowry. You saved your family name, William. You fulfilled your duty." Her gentle words carried the sting of ice. He flinched as if she'd struck him. "It was the only way. I had no choice, Elle. I have hated every moment of this day." He took a quick, desperate breath. "I was a soldier, tasked with a mission. I was made to believe that once I came home, this had to be done immediately. I never had a moment to explain, or—" His gaze dropped not to her face, but to the area on her chest where he knew the locket lay hidden. "Did you keep it?" he asked, his voice raw. Eleanor felt the locket beneath the silk. "I did," she admitted. "Then keep it," he commanded, his eyes snapping up to meet hers, fierce and compelling. "Keep it until the day I can take it back. Everything they saw today, the ring, the vows, the marriage, it is all facade, a lie to save a house, my heart." He closed the distance between them, leaning in until his voice was a warm tremor against her ear. "My heart made its vow beneath the oak, and that vow stands." The sound of Catherine's laughter, bright and close, echoing from the gallery, snapped them back to reality. William jerked back, his expression instantly shifting from tortured lover to polite host. "Go," he instructed, his voice low and urgent. "Return to the party. We cannot be seen. Not now." Eleanor didn't need to be told twice. She gave him one quick, agonized look that conveyed all the despair and love the ceremony had failed to extinguish. She turned and walked quickly away, leaving him alone in the shadowed corridor, a newly wedded husband bound by duty, yet irrevocably tied by a silent, forbidden gaze to his bride's sister. The wedding was over, but the conflict had just truly begun. That was the brutal, agonizing conclusion of part 1. The promise was shattered, the wedding performed, and the two souls who belonged together were formally separated by a gold band and a silk gown. Yet as Eleanor stood beside her sister at the altar and William's eyes locked with hers, a new, forbidden promise was made in silence. William and Catherine are now man and wife, but how long can two people who are irrevocably in love pretend to be strangers? How long until the polite mask slips and the fragile piece of Ashworth Hall breaks under the weight of temptation? The marriage has begun, but the real story, the desperate, dangerous story of the forbidden glances, is just about to unfold. Join us right now for part 2 to see how far duty can bend before it finally snaps.